Good day, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to NBI Quick Takes. My name is Annamaria Testani. I am Vice President of National Sales for National Bank Investments. And today I'm with Martin Lefebvre, who is our Chief Investment Officer and Strategist, who's here to talk to us about a couple of quick messages related to stocks and bonds. Martin, thank you for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me, Annamaria.
So moving along, one of the first questions I'd like to ask you is, how do we kind of sort of conciliate the greatest economic shock since the Great Depression that's happened within the stock market that is roughly flat year over year?
Well, Annamaria, that is a great question, and we could be spending a lot of time, I think, on this topic alone. At first sight, there indeed seems to be a disconnect between, on the one side, you got the bond yields, which are basically saying that things are really, really bad. I mean, you just have to look at unemployment rates across the globe to understand that. You take the US alone, about 20 million jobs were lost over the last 2 months. And then on the other side, you got the stock market, which is basically saying things are all right. We've seen a spectacular surge in prices since March's low. But you know what? It turns out that both sides may be right. Generally speaking, we know that interest rates and commodity prices are linked more towards the economy. Sometimes that is something that we refer to as a Main Street. And as such, because of the forced lockdowns that we're in and the impact on economic growth, well, it's no surprise to see the bond yields right now are hovering around historical lows, while energy prices are down markedly since the beginning of the year.
It makes a lot of sense what you just said, though. But aren't stocks also linked to the economy?
Absolutely, you're right. And that's done via the impact on corporate earnings. And that is exactly what people on Wall Street and Bay Street in Toronto are preoccupied with right now. But you also have to remember the stock market is all about expectations. So if we go back a little, and you will certainly recall this, the period of uncertainty that we're in also started with a spectacular correction of major equity markets around the world. And just to give you an example, the S&P 500 lost nearly 35% of its value in about just a few weeks before rebounding just as forcefully following two events. The first one being unprecedented fiscal and monetary measures across the globe. And then secondly, I think it was the hope that containment measures were working and would lead to an early reopening of economies. But to me, it's not the whole story. I mean, don't forget that equity indices are aggregates. So there's always winners and losers in all of this. So stocks that were negatively affected by the pandemic, you can think of airlines, cruise ships, and hotels, everything related to tourism. Have managed to rebound somewhat since the bottom, but they remain, badly hit. Meanwhile, there's also tech-heavy related stocks, and there you can think about social media, communication, or even online shopping that are really thriving in this confinement period that we're in. Other than that, you can think also about defensive sectors. Even though the stock market has rebounded, what we're seeing right now is the leadership is being assumed by defensive sector. And at the forefront of all of that, you got healthcare stocks. And I don't need to explain why those are doing well right now. So you can see that stocks are not completely ignoring what's going on. And while a lot of that has already been done, I think, to prevent the worst, well, there's still a lot of uncertainty. And that's why stocks have probably just recouped half of their peak to trough losses so far.
So, what I find also very interesting is, we keep kind of sort of alluding to this expression of uncertainty. And I think uncertainty has a different kind of connotation depending who the listener is. What comes to mind to you when you're using that word uncertainty in your analysis that you just provided us?
Well, for one thing, surely when we look at data, it will worsen. Okay, it's likely to worsen. So we've already know that GDP growth was down something like 4% in the first quarter, but the eye of the storm was more during springtime and more specifically April and part of May. So we're in it, and the second quarter is going to be really, really bad. So because of that, market are expecting that more will be done on the fiscal side. But the risk here is that while it was easy for government to quickly open the taps, they might be more reluctant to do it again in the face of already what you can probably dub astronomical deficit so far. Okay, so that's the first risk. There's also the risk of a second phase of COVID-19 if the economies do reopen and they do it too quickly. That seems to have happened in past pandemics, and it was certainly the case during the Spanish flu about 100 years ago. So right now, I think that markets are not too preoccupied by that because there is also a risk, and that's a positive one, that some drug will come and help soothe the illness, or even better, that a vaccine will see the day sooner than usual. That's probably something further down the road, but markets are really hoping that that will happen and may offset some of the risk linked to a reopening of the economies.
It makes absolutely sense, right? Because when we got hit with COVID, it was that unknown factor. Any future developments that will come from this, to your point, the unknown is known. Now it's just the unknown of how we're going to react or how to deal with that uncertainty. So absolutely makes perfect sense. Martin, you mentioned something interesting. You said unprecedented fiscal and monetary measures across the board. If we start with the former, can you give us an order of what is the magnitude of what that actually represents?
Annamaria, it's really huge. I mean, whether you talk about Canada, the USA, or Europe, it's all pretty much in the neighborhood of about 10% of GDP. So this represents the biggest rate since the Second World War. However, as you well know, economies are much bigger today than they were in the 1940s. So when you look at things in nominal terms, in absolute terms, the deficits today are the biggest ever recorded. So if you take the USA, for example, at around 12% of GDP, it amounts to more than 3 trillions of US dollars. And as I've mentioned before, more may be required soon.
So in other words, very small amount of monies that we're discussing. Interesting. But again, when you look at these amounts are, I think your word was astronomical. Who's going to actually pay for all this?
Oh, that's that one's a tough one, but I'm not sure we have the time to get into the details. But let's just say that the first one is, something had to be done. There's no sense in thinking about the water damages if you first don't put out the fire, right? So because we tend to look at deficits or debt and percentage of GDP, doing nothing meant that the denominator of your ratio, the GDP, would have shrank even more. Okay, so the ratio was set to to get really worse anyways. And if you don't do anything, then you run the risk of entering a depression phase that would take much longer to get out of. So something had to be done. The second thing is pretty much every country in the world is in a similar position. If it's only the US doing it and the rest of the world is fine, then relatively speaking, the US would get in a worse shape. But everybody's doing it. So this should limit the relative impact on interest rates and foreign exchange rates as well. The third thing is that with yields at 0%, well, I think that never in the history of mankind has there been a better time to do it, right? If you need to go in the red, at 0% is probably your best chance of doing it. And finally, to answer your question, I think that the probability is that nobody will ever repay that debt. For as long as we've got central banks doing QE, then governments will just issue new bonds to pay for the old ones and keep the wheel turning, a little bit like we've been seeing over the past couple of years in Japan, for example. So if eventually we get back on our feet, some government somewhere will be tempted by fiscal rectitude and maybe start talking about raising taxes, but that will take a lot of courage, and I don't think that we're there yet. There's also a possible risk that inflation will rise, and that will be problematic, but that's frankly, that's a whole other topic, and we'll have plenty of time to talk about that later.
I think what's interesting, Martin, is you've given us a lot of perspective. So there's a lot of unknowns still needed to be ironed out. I think you brought a lot of attention to the fact that certain measures have been put in place, rightly or wrongly, is to basically stem kind of sort of the worst case scenarios. NBI Quick Takes are basically ensure that can we give you that concise, quick information on some of these topics that are relevant to them. And Martin, I do want to thank you very much for taking the time for helping us, because you've definitely been educational for me. And you know what? I hope to have you again in the near future. So thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everyone.